Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. The Korean War and its Aftermath, 1950 to 1954. The emphasis by the American Armed Forces on nuclear retaliation as their chief response to communist aggression anywhere in the world made it necessary to draw a defense perimeter over which such aggression would trigger retaliation from us. Such a boundary had been established in Europe by the military occupation forces and NATO, but at the end of 1949 was still unspecified in the Far East because of the recent victory of the communists in China. At the insistence of the military leaders, especially General MacArthur, that perimeter was drawn to exclude Korea, Formosa, and mainland China. Accordingly, all American forces had been evacuated from South Korea in June 1949. In March of that year, MacArthur publicly stated, "Our defense line runs through the chain of islands fringing the coast of Asia. It starts from the Philippines and continues through the Ryukyu archipelago, which includes its broad main bastion, Okinawa. Then it bends back through Japan and the Aleutian Island chain to Alaska." The MacArthur defense perimeter in the Far East was accepted by Secretary of State Atkinson in a speech on January 12, 1950. But not at all in the sense in which partisan Republicans attacked it later. Atkinson specifically stated that America's guarantee was given only to areas east of that line, but that American power might be used to the west of it, where independent nations must first seek their security on their own initiative and the organized security system of the United Nations. To Atkinson, therefore, the boundary was not between areas we would defend and those we would not defend, but between those we would defend unilaterally and those we would defend collectively. However, it seems clear that in private, by the end of 1949, all parts of the administration in Washington looked forward to the fall of Formosa, the complete disappearance of Chiang Kai-shek, the recognition of Red China, and its admission to the United Nations as preliminaries to an intensive diplomatic effort to exploit the split between Soviet Russia and Communist China, which was regarded as inevitable. This vision of Chinese Titoism never became public policy, but on October 12, 1949, after the JCS under Eisenhower voted that Formosa was not of sufficient strategic importance to warrant its occupation by American troops, the three defense departments and the Department of State agreed unanimously that Formosa would be conquered by Red China by the end of 1950. Whatever merits there may have been in our Far Eastern defense perimeter and its implications for Formosa, it clearly left Korea in an ambiguous position. The Soviet Union interpreted this ambiguity to mean that the United States would allow South Korea to be conquered by North Korea, just as Red China, about the same time, assumed that the United States would permit it to conquer Formosa. Instead, when Russia, through its satellite, North Korea, sought to take Korea before Red China had taken Formosa, this gave rise to an American counteraction which prevented either aggressor from getting its aim. There can be little doubt that the United States, along with the rest of the world, underestimated the almost insanely aggressive nature of Red China. From 1949 onward, this newly established regime tried to bite every friendly hand which tried to lead it into the community of established nations. It made it perfectly clear to all its neighbors in Asia that its policies would be based on hatred for any country which did not break with the United States and line up with the Soviet Union. Even India, which leaned over backward to be friendly, with unabraded, almost daily, inextravagant insults, of which one of the more moderate was a charge that Nehru was the running dog of British American imperialists. When Great Britain offered diplomatic recognition in January 1950, it was rebuffed. Nor was this aggressive behavior only verbal. In spite of the devastation and economic dislocation of the Civil War, Red Chinese plans for aggression continued. The general level of Chinese production in 1949 was about half what it had been in 1942, and the country clearly needed an interval to recuperate. But the budget for 1950 allotted 40% of its funds for the armed services, imposed a tax of 20% on peasant agricultural incomes, and anticipated a deficit of nearly 20% to be covered by printing paper money. Its declared immediate plans included the conquest of Hainan Island, Formosa, and Tibet. Hainan was conquered in April 1950, and the build-up against Formosa continued for at least 2 months more. About 20,000 Koreans in the Chinese forces were detached and returned to North Korea, where they joined the armed forces of the People's Republic of Korea, PRK, that is, North Korea Communist Republic. This may have been done at Russia's request. On June 25, 1950, after a 2-hour artillery bombardment, 60,000 North Koreans, led by 100 Soviet tanks, crossed the 38th parallel and flung themselves on 90,000 lightly armed and already dispirited South Korean troops. The latter, lacking tanks, planes, or heavy artillery, reeled backward to the south and did not stop until August 6th, when they finally made a stand before Busan in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula. In this retreat, ROK troops suffered 50,000 casualties in the first month. For 48 hours after the Korean attack, the world hesitated, awaiting America's reaction. On June 26, 1950, the 5th birthday of the United Nations, many feared a Munich, leading to the collapse of the whole United Nations security system at its first major challenge. Truman's reaction, however, was decisive. He immediately committed American air and sea forces in the area south of 38 degrees and demanded a UN condemnation of the aggression. Thus, for the first time in history, a world organization voted to use collective force to stop armed aggression. This was possible because the North Korean attack occurred at a time when the Soviet delegation was absent from the United Nations Security Council, boycotting it in protest at the presence of the delegation from nationalist China. Accordingly, the much-used Soviet veto was unavailable. On June 27, 1950, the Security Council, with Yugoslavia casting the only opposing vote, condemned the aggression and asked its members to give assistance to South Korea. On the same day, President Truman ordered American forces into action and sent the United States 7th Fleet to neutralize the Formosa Strait, where the Red Chinese armies were still poised for their invasion of Formosa. This rapid response won general approval within the United States, even from those who later condemned and opposed it. One of these was Senator Taft, who prefaced his temporary approval by charging that all the troubles in the Far East arose from the Democrats' sympathetic acceptance of communism, and that the North Korean attack was in response to the invitation contained in Atkinson's speech of January 12th. Is it any wonder that the Korean communists took us at the word given by the Secretary of State? He demanded Atkinson's immediate resignation, a cry which continued almost uninterruptedly over the next 2.5 years. The president's order for ground forces to rescue the South Koreans was not easy to carry out. Air Force success in its budget struggles with the other services and the general budget cutting by the Republican 8th Congress, January 1947 to January 1949. The 4 occupation divisions had left the ground forces with only 10 Army and 2 Marine Corps divisions, all seriously undermanned. The 4th Occupation Division in the Far East, which had to respond to the Korean attack, had a total of only 25 infantry battalions, instead of the 36 allotted. These and other units had to be brought up to strength by calling up reservists. Nevertheless, 1 division from Japan reached Korea by July 9th, a second by July 12th, and a third on July 18th. The intervention of American forces in Korea was undoubtedly a great shock to the Communists, especially as the North Korean attack was a Soviet operation, while the American landing directly threatened the security of Red China. Coordination between the 2 communist powers was far from perfect and was certainly slow. The Red Chinese had no desire to see American forces re-established on the Asiatic mainland, or in occupation of all Korea up to the Chinese boundary along the Yalu River. On the other hand, they had no desire to get into a war with the United States to prevent this undesired consequence of what was really a Moscow operation, especially as Soviet support was very remote, at the farther end of a long single-track railway across Siberia. Nevertheless, the Red Chinese suspended their attack on Formosa and, in the course of July, assembled several 100,000 troops in northeast China, considerably withdrawn from the Yalu. For weeks, the successful advance of the North Koreans gave the Chinese hope that they need do nothing. The South Koreans were quickly hurled down to the southeastern corner of the country at Busan, and for several weeks were on the verge of being pushed into the sea. Their line held, however, and American forces began to assemble in the protected beachhead. The United States was as eager as the Chinese to avoid a direct clash between the 2 countries, because such a clash could easily build up into a major war in the Far East, leaving Russia free to do its will in Europe. Washington was fearful that Chiang Kai-shek, since he would not reconquer China himself and hoped America would do it for him, might seek to precipitate such a war by making an attack from Formosa on mainland China. There was also a strong chance that MacArthur might encourage or allow Chiang to do so, because that haughty general agreed with Chiang that Europe was of no importance and that the Far East should be the primary, almost the only area of operations for American foreign policy. He had bitterly opposed the Germany First strategy throughout World War II, and had begrudged men of supplies sent there on the grounds that these diversions delayed his triumphant return to the Philippines. As the war drew to its close, he had said, "Europe is a dying system. It is worn out and run down, and will become an economic and industrial hegemony of Soviet Russia. The lands touching the Pacific with their billions of inhabitants will determine the course of history for the next 10,000 years." These views were shared by the right-wing isolationist groups of the Republican Party, with whom MacArthur had been in close touch for much of his life, and to whom he owed some of his success. In American politics, these groups had power to do considerable damage because of their influence on the Republican Congressional Party, and the fact that the bipartisan foreign policy under Senator Arthur Vanderburg of Michigan, which operated elsewhere in the world, did not exist in regard to the Far East. The danger of any Chiang-MacArthur cooperation to build the Korean action up into a major war was intensified by the fact that this would be opposed by the United Nations and by our allies, neither of whom was considered important by the Neo-isolationists or by MacArthur, but whom the Truman administration refused to alienate unnecessarily because they were essential as bases in the containment of Russia. In the first 2 weeks of August, another American division and parts of other units, including a Marine Corps brigade, landed at Pusan. By the middle of the month, that enclave was entrenched, and a counteroffensive to drive the North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel was being prepared. At that point, MacArthur made a brilliant suggestion. To avoid the hard push up the peninsula, he proposed landing 2 American divisions at Inchon, halfway up the west side of Korea, 50 miles south of the 38th parallel, and only 25 miles from Seoul, the capital. Everything was averse to the plan, unless there was complete tactical surprise. Fortunately, this was achieved, a rather unexpected event in the East. Marine units landed at Inchon from the sea on September 15th and found little opposition. On September 22nd, they captured Seoul, and 6 days later were joined by the main United Nations offensive driving up the peninsula from Pusan. About half the PRK forces were captured in the bag, while the rest fled northward across the 38th parallel and to North Korea. That frontier was reached by the UN forces as the month ended. The Red Chinese decision to intervene in North Korea was made about the 3rd week in August and began on October 15th, 9 days after American troops crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea. Such an intervention was almost inevitable, as Red China could hardly be expected to allow the buffer North Korean state to be destroyed and American troops to occupy the line of the Yalu without taking some steps to protect its own security. China would have welcomed the restoration of the boundary along the 38th parallel, which Russia had so carelessly destroyed by instigating the PRK attack in June. By October, they feared that the United States was about to use the Korean area as a base for a general war on China. In such a war, the Chinese expected to become the target of atom bombs, but believed that they could survive if they could wipe out the United Nations Korean base for ground operations. Accordingly, as soon as it became clear that American forces would continue past the 38th parallel to the Yalu, the Chinese intervened, not to restore the 38th parallel frontier, but to clear the United Nations forces from Asia completely. The Chinese intervention in Korea, which began on October 15, 1950, was a much greater surprise than Inchon, and gave rise to one of the most bitter controversies in American political history, the so-called Truman-MacArthur controversy. The dispute arose from the fact that MacArthur did not accept his government's strategic and political plans and systematically sought to undermine and redirect them, while in constant communication with the press and with the leaders of the opposition political party for this purpose. The Truman administration, after the victory at Inchon, did not intend to stop at the 38th parallel and hoped to reunite the country under the Seoul government. It is probable that this alone triggered the Chinese intervention, but to reduce that possibility, Washington set certain restrictions on MacArthur's actions, which he soon sought to evade. Washington and Tokyo both knew that the Chinese had about 300,000 troops ready for action in Manchuria, north of the Yalu, and that neither Russia nor China was attempting to re-equip the shattered North Korean forces. To discourage any Chinese intervention, the White House forbade any attack by Chiang on the Chinese coast, any naval blockade of China itself. Korea, of course, was blockaded, or any attack on China or Siberia north of the Yalu. or the use of non-Korean troops in the immediate vicinity of the Yalu, as the conquest of North Korea was completed. On October 9, 1950, two of MacArthur's planes attacked a Russian airbase 62 miles inside Russian territory and only 18 miles from Vladivostok. To make certain that MacArthur understood the reasons for these restrictions, President Truman the next day instructed MacArthur to meet him at Wake Island on October 15th. The two leaders had a lengthy discussion in which these restrictions were reiterated. But within 2 months of his return to Japan, MacArthur recommenced his almost daily interviews and letters agitating against these limits. At Wake Island, General MacArthur assured President Truman that any Chinese intervention into Korea would be most unlikely, and in any case would be on a scale which could be handled. Even as he spoke, the first Chinese units were already crossing the Yalu River from Manchuria into North Korea. These engaged in combat on October 26th, and by October 30th, some had been captured. MacArthur continued to deny that any significant Chinese intervention was present or likely, and tried to discourage it by a vigorous attack northward against the North Korean remnants. Because of lack of American troops for an attack across the width of the peninsula, he divided his forces into two separate attacks on either side of the peninsula, with no direct liaison between the two, where a considerable gap was left. Moreover, MacArthur on October 24th canceled the restrictions on use of non-Korean forces close to the Chinese and Russian borders. His specific communique of November 5th, which opened his northward offensive, spoke of it as one which would, for all practical purposes, end the war and bring the United Nations forces home by Christmas. Until November 26th, the MacArthur offensive rolled northward against only moderate resistance. Just as it reached the Yalu frontier, at some points, a gigantic Chinese offensive of 33 divisions counterattacked into the gap between the two UN wings. MacArthur's communique of November 28th spoke of the Chinese attack as a new war, which has shattered the high hopes we entertained that the intervention of the Chinese was only of a token nature on a volunteer and individual basis. At once, he began an intensive propaganda campaign, both to obtain his earlier aims for direct attacks on coastal China and air attacks on interior points, and to rewrite the history of the preceding month so that his own actions would seem to be premeditated and skilled ripostes to Chinese plans. In fact, his public statement of November 28th was in sharp contrast with his private message to Washington almost 4 weeks earlier, which estimated the Chinese forces across the Yalu as 500,000 men in 56 regular army divisions, supported by 370,000 district security forces. In the face of such knowledge, no excuse can be found for MacArthur's use of a divided command with a central gap to attack toward such a force. The Chinese attack in MacArthur's mind reduced the American situation in the Far East to a simple choice between two extreme alternatives: either all-out war on China and possibly Russia to destroy world communism once and for all, or the immediate evacuation of our forces from Korea. The former would have given the Soviet Union a free hand in Europe. The latter would have made it impossible for us to obtain resistance against communist nibbling from any small states or even from our greater allies elsewhere in the world, and would have destroyed our prestige in Asia and Africa. A rapid visit by Generals J. Lawton Collins and Hoyt S. Vandenberg to Korea in January 12th through the 17th, 1951, convinced them that the middle alternative, which was still Washington's policy, namely to maintain the independence of South Korea, was still possible. Rather than accept this alternative, MacArthur intensified his press barrage against the administration, as well as his numerous messages to isolationist Republican politicians in Washington. A directive of December 6th, which ordered him to clear his public statements on foreign and military policy with the respective departments, was violated for some months with impunity. The congressional elections of 1950 had been disastrous to administration supporters and had been successful for isolationists of both parties, with the administration's majority in both houses cut almost to nothing. Senator Taft, now unchallenged leader of the isolationist bloc, argued that Governor Dewey's internationalist approach had lost the presidential election of 1948, and that his own wholesale opposition to the administration on an isolationist basis had been victorious in 1950 and would win the presidency, apparently for himself, in 1952. On this basis, powerful attack was built up against Secretary of State Atkinson, against NATO and other American commitments in Europe, and against foreign aid or any efforts to extend America's ground forces. Truman's efforts to send 4 divisions to Europe and to make General Eisenhower supreme commander of NATO were violently opposed by Taft, who had voted against ratification of NATO, and by Senator Worry, the Republican floor leader. Every effort was made to reduce the defense of the United States to a simple matter of control of the air and the oceans, without need for overseas forces or overseas allies. All this, of course, was simply a refusal to face 20th century conditions by men with 19th century ideas, and gave great support to MacArthur's insubordination. This insubordination and the general's alliance with the Republican opposition in the Congress was brought to a head on April 5, 1951, when the House Republican leader, Joseph Martin, read to the Congress a letter from MacArthur, which was a broad-gauged propagandist attack on the Truman administration's policies in the Far East. Truman used this as an excuse to remove MacArthur, although his real reason was the general's sabotage of American and British efforts to negotiate an end of the war along the 38th parallel. 5 days after the MacArthur-Martin letter had been read in Congress, Truman removed the general from all his commands in the Far East. This was used by the isolationist opposition for a great triumphal homecoming for MacArthur. The Republican leaders spoke publicly of impeaching the president. Senator Nixon wanted congressional censure of the president and restoration of MacArthur to his commands, since his removal was appeasement of world communism. McCarthy said the president had made the decision while he was drunk, while Senator William Jenner said from the Senate floor, "This country today is in the hands of a secret inner courtier, which is directed by agents of the Soviet Union. We must cut this whole cancerous conspiracy out of our government at once. Our only choice is to impeach President Truman and find out who is the secret invisible government which has so cleverly led our country down the road to destruction." Sentiments similar to these were frequent, both in public and in private, for the next few years. MacArthur's return to the United States after an absence of almost 15 years was built up into an amazing display of popular hysteria. On landing at San Francisco, he was greeted by 500,000 people in one of the greatest traffic jams in the city's history. At Washington's airport, after midnight on April 19th, the crowds broke out of control. That afternoon, before a joint session of Congress and over a nationwide television broadcast, he made a speech which ranged from old-fashioned eloquence to pure ham. It ended on pathos. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. and like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. This was followed by a parade in Washington before 250,000 spectators. But the real climax was reached in New York the following day, when, for 6.5 hours, more than 7 million people spread over a 19-mile parade route cheered themselves hoarse over the general. This was twice the crowd which had seen Eisenhower's return from Europe after the defeat of Germany in 1945. The general did not fade away immediately. By May, he was back in Washington as star witness for the prosecution in a congressional investigation into the country's Far East policies. Only an infinitesimal fraction of those who had cheered the general so heartily 2 weeks before paid any attention to the hearings. This was unfortunate. MacArthur seriously maintained that his policies could lead to the total defeat of Communist China without any increase in ground forces, simply by naval and economic blockade of China, by air attack on Chinese industry, and by lifting the wraps of Chiang Kai-shek. On this basis, he promised immediate victory with a minimum of risk and casualties. The administration's policy, he insisted, was not victory, but to go on indecisively fighting with no mission for the troops except to resist and fight, continued an indefinite extension of bloodshed. Subsequent testimony from others, including the country's leading military experts and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, showed the unsubstantial nature of this vision of utopia. They rejected MacArthur's ideas as unrealistic and impossible. The bombing of Manchuria alone would take twice as many bombers as Strategic Air Command had available. Bombing of Chinese industry would not deprive the Chinese of military supplies, as their arsenals were in the Soviet Union. An economic and naval blockade could not seriously injure a country as self-sufficient as China, with an open land frontier, and could not be effective at all unless active military combat on the ground increased consumption rates. Efforts to adopt these policies would alienate the United States from its allies and the United Nations, and would jeopardize the whole anti-Soviet position in Europe. Few Americans followed the arguments to this point, but MacArthur had given the opposition a new war cry. In war there is no substitute for victory. This slogan, in which neither war nor victory was defined, was used as a weapon by the Neo-isolationists, partisan Republicans, and radical right for more than a decade, although by 1960 it had been shortened to the charge that the Democrats favored a no-win policy. After a decade of reiteration, many persons seriously believed that it was impossible to stop communism without all-out nuclear war, and that continued survival, instead of mutual destruction, could not possibly be regarded as winning. Peace had become appeasement. These neo-isolationist policies had no relationship to reality, but they exerted great pressure on the last 2 years of the Truman administration, driving it toward an increasingly unrealistic course. In 1951, Senator Taft was advocating a threefold program of reduced military preparedness, reduced government expenditures, and a more aggressive foreign policy in the Far East. This combination could be supported only by assuming a number of things which were not true. One of these was that Chiang Kai-shek's regime on Formosa was still a great power, and that Red China, on the other hand, was on the verge of collapse, and was indeed so weakened that Chiang would be enthusiastically welcomed back if he merely landed on the mainland. This unrealistic version of the present could be sustained only by an equally unrealistic version of the past. that the Red victory in China was the inevitable consequence of opposition to Chiang by the democratic administrations of Roosevelt and Truman, and that this opposition was caused by the existence within the administrations of communists and communist sympathizers from the top down. Since almost all experts, including scientists, area and subject experts, and military men, did not accept this version, either of the past or the present, all experts were regarded as suspect and insulted or ignored. In fact, educated or thoughtful men were generally rejected. Instead, emphasis was placed on practical men, defined as those who had met a payroll or carried a precinct. This admitted to the charmed circle businessmen and politicians of local stature, like Senator Wary. On the whole, the neo-isolationist discontent was a revolt of the ignorant against the informed or educated of the 19th century, against the insoluble problems of the 20th, of the Midwest, of Tom Sawyer against the cosmopolitan East of J.P. Morgan and Company, of old Siwish against Harvard, of the Chicago Tribune against the Washington Post or the New York Times, of simple absolutes against complex relativisms, of immediate final solutions against long-range partial alleviations, of frontier activism against European thought, a rejection out of hand of all complexities of life, which had arisen since 1915 in favor of a nostalgic return to the simplicities of 1905, and above all, a desire to get back to the inexpensive, thoughtless, and irresponsible international security of 1880. This neurotic impulse swept over the United States in a great wave in the years 1948 to 1955. Supported by hundreds of thousands of self-seeking individuals, especially peddlers of publicity and propaganda, and financed no longer by the relatively tied-up funds of declining Wall Street international finance, but by its successors, the freely available winnings of self-financing industrial profits from such new industrial activities as air power, electronics, chemicals, light metals, or natural gas, which, although utterly dependent on government spending or government-protected exploitation of limited natural resources, such as uranium or oil, pretended to themselves and their listeners that their affluence was entirely due to their own cleverness. At the head of this list were the new millionaires, led by the Texas and Southwest oil and natural gas plungers, whose fortunes were based on tricky tax provisions and government-subsidized transportation systems. This shift occurred on all levels, from changing tastes in newspaper comic strips, from Mutt and Jeff, or Bringing Up Father, to Steve Canyon, or Little Orphan Annie, to profound changes in the power nexus of the American establishment. It was evident in the decline of J.P. Morgan itself, from its deeply anonymous status as a partnership founded in 1861 to its transformation into an incorporated public company in 1940, and its final disappearance by absorption into its chief banking subsidiary, the Guaranteed Trust Company, in 1959. Incorporation reflected the need to escape the incidence of the inheritance tax, while its final disappearance was based on the relative decrease in large security flotations, in contrast to the great increase in industrial self-financing, best represented by DuPont and its longtime subsidiary General Motors, or by Ford. The less obvious implications of this shift were illustrated in a story which passed through Ivy League circles in 1948, in connection with the choice of a new president for Columbia University. This, of all universities, had been the one closest to J.P. Morgan and Company, and its president, Nicholas Murray Butler, was Morgan's chief spokesman from ivied halls. He had been chosen under Morgan influence, but the events of 1930 to 1948, which so weakened Morgan in the economic system, also weakened his influence on the Board of Trustees of Columbia, until it became evident that Morgan did not have the votes to elect a successor. However, Morgan, that is, Tom Lamont, did have the votes to preserve the status quo, and, accordingly, President Butler was kept in his position until he was long past his physical ability to carry on its functions. Finally, he had to retire. Even then, Lamont and his allies were able to prevent choice of a successor and postponed it, making the university treasurer acting president in the hope that a favorable change in the Board of Trustees might make it possible for Morgan once again to name a Columbia president. Fate decreed otherwise, for Lamont died in 1948, and shortly afterward a committee of trustees under Thomas Watson of International Business Machines was empowered to seek a new president. This was not an area in which the genius of IBM was at his most effective. While on a business trip to Washington, he confided his problem to a friend who helpfully suggested, "Have you thought of Eisenhower?" By this, he meant Milton Eisenhower, then president of Penn State, later president of Johns Hopkins. Watson, who apparently did not think immediately of this lesser-known member of the Eisenhower family, thanked his friend and began the steps which soon made Dwight Eisenhower, for 2 unhappy years, president of Columbia. In the face of the public opinion of 1950 to 1952, the Truman administration had to make some concessions to the power of neo-isolationism. The loyalty program to ferret out subversives was established in the government. During the MacArthur hearings of May 1951, Dean Atkinson promised that under no circumstances would Red China be accepted into the community of nations. Aid and support to Chiang was increased, and John Foster Dulles was brought into the State Department. None of these charges helped the Truman administration's popularity, as was clearly shown in the election of 1952, but they had major repercussions on history. One of these was Dulles's success in obtaining a peace treaty for Japan, September 8, 1951. Dulles, like the Columbia presidency, was a former Morgan satellite, which had been lost about the same time and for the same reasons. As a partner in Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the Wall Street legal firms closely associated with Morgan, Dulles operated very much in the Morgan vineyard until the late 1940s. An early advocate of bipartisanship in foreign affairs, a Wall Street specialty, he was first brought into Democratic State Department circles, largely under Morgan sponsorship. In 1945, as advisor to Secretary of State Stettinius at the San Francisco Conference. These associations continued at various meetings and conferences, mostly at the United Nations and at the 4 post-war foreign ministers' conferences of 1945 to 1949. But in 1948, a change occurred when Dulles's naturally exaggerated personal ambition got out of hand at the same time that he drifted out of the Wall Street constellations with which his whole career had been associated. Apparently, he decided he could get further on his own, especially by adapting himself to the swelling tide of neo-isolationism. The marks of this change were his appointments to the United States Senate by Governor Dewey of New York in July 1949, and his resignation from Sullivan and Cromwell at that time. In the election of November 1949, Dulles was defeated for the full senatorial term by ex-governor Herbert Lehman, also of a Wall Street background. In the campaign, Dulles tried to portray Lehman as having communist inclinations and went so far as to say that the election of Lehman would permit the communists to chalk up another victory in their struggle to get into office here. In retirement after this electoral defeat, Dulles continued his movement toward isolationism and unilateralism, a process which was completed by his article, A Policy of Boldness, in Life magazine, May 19, 1952, and in his subsequent efforts to keep President Eisenhower from standing up against McCarthyism. This movement was marked by increasing neglect of Europe and opposition to our chief allies there, and increasing concern with the Far East and their curative powers of strategic nuclear bombing. The Japanese peace treaty was one of the last constructive achievements of Dulles and was reached without support of the Soviet Union, which refused to sign it. Communist China was also excluded. The treaty's chief aim was to end the Pacific War within a larger security structure, which bound the previous enemies to a mutual security system. It had three parts: the peace treaty with Japan, which accepted its loss of the already detached areas and islands; the Anzu Treaty, which allied Australia, New Zealand, and the United States; and a bilateral mutual defense pact between Japan and the United States. The neo-isolationist surge in American public opinion so paralyzed the freedom of action of the Truman administration that it was unable to negotiate any settlement of the war in Korea. Every effort at negotiation gave rise to howls of appeasement or treason. Moreover, the communists, while willing to negotiate, showed no eagerness to make an agreement, with the result that negotiations crawled along for 2 years in the isolated military quarters at Panmunjom in Korea. The Kremlin was quite willing to keep America's men, money, and attention tied down in Korea, and could find each day an additional argument to throw as an obstacle into the negotiations. Most of these obstacles were concerned with the disposition of prisoners of war, thousands of whom did not want to return to communist territory, while only 21 captured Americans were unwilling to return to the United States. Simply by insisting that all prisoners must be forced to return, the communists could extend the negotiations indefinitely in time and thus postpone the day when the United States might be free to turn its men and resources to other areas closer to the Soviet Union, and thus more dangerous to it, such as Europe. Only the death of Stalin in March 1953 broke this stalemate. As soon as the first confusion over this issue had passed temporarily, it became possible to make a Korean truce, an achievement helped by the ascension of a new Republican administration in Washington in January. The truce was signed on July 27, 1953, after 37 months of war, in which the United States had lost 25,000 dead, 115,000 other casualties, and about $22 billion in costs. The Korean War had a totally different impact on the scientists, the democratic leaders, the army, some of the navy, the new group of strategic intellectuals, and non-middle-class educated persons in general, than it had on the neo-isolationists, the Republican leaders, the Air Force, big business, and the newly forming radical right publicists. To the latter groups, it was a totally unnecessary and frustrating experience, resulting from the incompetence or treason of their opponents, an aberration and throwback to World War I, which must never be permitted to reoccur. To the former alignment, however, the limited war in Korea was an inevitable consequence of nuclear stalemate, arising from the very nature of communist aggression and of the revolutionary discontents of the buffer fringe, and would be a constantly threatening possibility in the future, either in Korea itself or in a dozen other places along the edges of the communist bloc. Accordingly, this motley alignment, led by its scientists and liberals, began to work to strengthen America's ability to face any new challenge similar to Korea. In a military sense, this inevitably led to efforts to increase the ability of Europe and America to wage limited war, whatever the cost. The right, as the defenders of material comforts, were unwilling to engage in such an effort on the basis of cost alone, and soon convinced themselves that it was unnecessary. The tactical experience of Korea showed clearly that we had neither the weapons nor the training for limited war, and that the Air Force's claims for the effectiveness of its strategic weapons were as unrealistic as they had been since Dewey. Even the tactical air units had been ineffective, chiefly because they were designed and used in a separate service dominated by big bomber generals. Some of the most effective work had been done by tools, such as helicopters, which the Air Force refused to study or order. To remedy this weakness, the Army's specialist on airborne warfare, General James M. Gavin, was sent with a team of scientists to Korea in the autumn of 1950. At the time, General Gavin, longtime officer of the heroic 82nd Airborne Division, was much worried at the Air Force's efforts to monopolize all the air and all nuclear weapons, at its resentment at possession of aviation by the Navy and Marines, and its refusal to provide effective tactical support for the air for ground forces, or to buy the equipment needed to provide proper airborne mobility, both of men and supplies, for ground troops. The team of scientists who went to the Far East with General Gavin in September through November 1950 included C.C. Lawrenston, professor of physics at the California Institute of Technology, who had developed the whole array of Navy and Air Force rockets in World War II, and had been Oppenheimer's assistant at Los Alamos during the last year of the war. Dr. William B. Shockley of Bell Telephone Laboratories, developer of the transistor, who won the Nobel Prize in 1956, and Dr. Edward Bowles of MIT, our chief expert on military applications of radar in World War II. From their discussions emerged a series of scientific research projects in 1951 to 1952, which had a profound effect on American defense capabilities. Project Vista, with President Lee Dubridge of Caltech as chairman and Lawrenston as his deputy, made an overall study of defense problems for the Department of Defense. In general, it sought to reach a well-rounded, diverse defense establishment which could respond effectively to any degree of aggression and do it on land, sea, or air. One of its chief efforts was to get tactical air power for the ground forces and to counteract the massed Soviet army in Europe by development of tactical nuclear weapons, as well as nuclear warheads to be carried on rockets of 50 to 300-mile range, so that the forcible dispersion of Russian infantry to avoid annihilation would sharply reduce its offensive impact. These weapons could be used to get all-weather tactical bombing support under Army control, to replace the fair-weather Air Force tactical bombing, which had proved so ineffective in Korea. The Vista Report, which was submitted to the secretaries of the forces in February 1952, made at least a dozen suggestions, of which at least 10 were eventually carried out, despite the fact that the report was never accepted. The reason for its rejection was the violent opposition of the Air Force, which disliked most of it, but really exploded when they found in Chapter 5 that it recommended dividing nuclear materials among the 3 services. The Air Force flatly refused to yield up any fissionable materials to the other services. At first, it insisted that there was not enough. When months of argument proved there was plenty, the Air Force simply tripled its requirements. When the Air Force discovered that Oppenheimer had written the introductory section of Chapter 5, his fate was sealed. Stories about his unreliability were passed about, and eventually it was said that he had somehow rewritten Chapter 5 and inserted it without the committee members knowing what he was doing. Project Charles and its sequel Project Lincoln were equally objectionable to the Air Force, although they had been instigated by it. Charles suggested that a permanent research laboratory should be established to study the technical problems of air defense. Accordingly, in September 1951, the Lincoln Laboratory was set up at MIT. This eventually had a staff of 1,600 on an annual budget of $20 million. Its special summer project, Lincoln, in 1951, included many of the scientists, such as DeBridge, Lawrenston, Zacharias, and Oppenheimer of Project Vista. It estimated that American defense against a Soviet air attack was woefully weak and could not expect to knock down more than 20% of the attacking planes, a rate far too low to be acceptable in nuclear warfare. Setting a 70% kill rate as a minimum aspiration, Project Lincoln recommended establishment of a distant early warning radar detection net across Canada and Greenland, the so-called DEW line. Much improved fighter and missile interception in deep air defense, DAD, and the development of an elaborate integrated automatic air defense communications system. The cost of this program, billions of dollars, made it less than welcome to the Air Force. To combat it, Air Force supporters spread rumors that a clique of scientists, which they called Zork, Zacharias, Oppenheimer, Rabi, and Charles Lawrenston, were out to destroy Strategic Air Command by devising, or pretending to devise, a near-perfect air defense for the United States. Thus, DOODAD, according to Strategic Air Command supporters, would be America's Maginot Line, behind which the country would lie helplessly bankrupt from its cost of $100 billion. The Air Force, from its control over the Lincoln Laboratory's budget, was successful in forcing MIT to suppress the DOODAD report. At least, it was never published. But part of the story, including the horror story about Zork, was published in the May 1953 issue of Fortune magazine, and some of the rest came out in the 1954 hearing on Oppenheimer's security. The third significant effort in the scientists' campaign for American survival in the early 1950s was known as Project East River. It was also instigated by the Air Force early in 1952 and studied the problem of civil defense through a scientific team headed by Lloyd Berkner, and studied the problem of civil defense through a scientific team headed by Lloyd Berkner of Associated Universities. It advocated a fantastically expensive program of air raid warnings, civilian defense shelters, and radar decentralization, but little was ever done about it. Since such a defensive system would undoubtedly save scores of millions of lives in any all-out nuclear war, and would permit the United States to withstand a Soviet first strike, The failure to follow up these recommendations is clearly attributable to the cost, a sum which many felt we could not afford, and which the Air Force was convinced could be far better spent on building up the offensive power of Strategic Air Command. Some of it did go for this purpose. The Air Force, which had 48 wings, of which 18 were in Strategic Air Command in June 1950, when the Korean War began, had 95 wings in July 1952, as the presidential campaign began, and had 110 wings, of which 42 wings were in Strategic Air Command at the end of 1953, in the last Truman budget. During these years, covering the last 4 budgets of the Truman period, expenditures on national security increased from $13 billion in 1949 to 1950 to over $50 billion in 1952 to 1953. A fair amount of this increase went for the changes recommended by the scientists, such as the DEW line, increase in Army ground forces from 10 to 20 divisions, and increased air transportation. As a consequence, American power relative to Soviet power reached its highest point in the post-war period about the end of 1953. It then lost ground until its recovery in the missile race of 1958 to 1963. The lines of the earlier buildup, as recommended by the various scientific defense projects of 1950 to 1952, were summed up in a general survey for the incoming Eisenhower administration in NSC 141. This document did not replace, but supplemented more intensive efforts in air defense, civil defense, and in military assistance in the Near East and Far East.